I know this for a fact because when I was growing up, my mother's limited English limited my perception of her. I was ashamed of her English. I believe that her English reflected the quality of what she had to say. That is, because she expressed them imperfectly, her thoughts were imperfect. And I had plenty of empirical evidence to support me. The fact that people in department stores, at banks, and at restaurants didn't take her seriously, didn't give her good service, pretended not to understand her, or even acted as if they didn't hear her. My mother has long realized the limitations of her English as well. When I was 15, she used to have me call people on the phone to pretend I was she. In this guise, I was forced to ask for information or even to complain and yell at people who had been rude to her. One time, it was a call to her stockbroker in New York. She had cashed out her small portfolio, and it just so happened we were going to New York the next week, our very first trip outside California. I had to get on the phone and say in an adolescent voice that was not very convincing, "This is Mrs. Tan." And my mother was standing in the back, whispering loudly, "Why, he don't send me check already 2 weeks late. So mad he lied to me, losing me money." And then I said in perfect English, "Yes, I'm getting rather concerned. You had agreed to send the check 2 weeks ago, but it hasn't arrived." Then she began to talk more loudly. "What he want? I come to New York, tell him in front of his boss, you cheating me?" And I was trying to calm her down, make her be quiet, while telling the stockbroker, "I can't tolerate any more excuses. If I don't receive the check immediately, I'm going to have to speak to your manager when I'm in New York next week." And sure enough, the following week, there we were, in front of his astonished stockbroker, and I was sitting there, red-faced and quiet. And my mother, the real Mrs. Tan, was shouting at his boss in her impeccable, broken English. We used a similar routine just 5 days ago for a situation that was far less humorous. My mother had gone to the hospital for an appointment to find out about a benign brain tumor a CAT scan had revealed a month ago. She said she had spoken very good English, her best English, no mistakes. Still, she said, the hospital did not apologize when they said they had lost the CAT scan, and she'd come for nothing. She said they did not seem to have any sympathy when she told them she was anxious to know the exact diagnosis, since her husband and son had both died of brain tumors. She said they would not give her any more information until the next time, and she would have to make another appointment for that. So she said she would not leave until the doctor called her daughter. She wouldn't budge. And when the doctor finally called her daughter, me, who spoke in perfect English, lo and behold, we had assurances the CAT scan would be found, promises that a conference call on Monday would be held, and apologies for any suffering my mother had gone through for a most regrettable mistake. I think my mother's English almost had an effect on limiting my possibilities in life as well. Sociologists and linguists probably will tell you that a person's developing language skills are more influenced by peers, but I do think that the language spoken in the family, especially in immigrant families, which are more insular, plays a large role in shaping the language of the child. And I believe it has affected my results on achievement tests, IQ tests, and the ACT. While my English skills were never judged as poor compared to math, English could not be considered my strong suit. In grade school, I did moderately well, getting perhaps B, sometimes B pluses in English, and scoring perhaps in the 16th, 60th, or 70th percentile on achievement tests. But those scores weren't good enough to override the opinion that my true abilities lay in math and science, because in those areas, I achieved A's and scored in the 90th percentile or higher. This was understandable. Math is precise. There's only one correct answer, whereas for me at least, the answers on English tests were always a judgment call, a matter of opinion and personal experience. Those tests were constructed around items like fill-in-the-blank sentence completion, such as, "Even though Tom was blank, Mary thought he was blank." And the correct answer always seemed to be the most bland combinations of thoughts. For example, "Even though Tom was shy, Mary thought he was charming," with a grammatical structure even though limiting the correct answer to some sort of semantic opposites. So you wouldn't get answers like, "Even though Tom was foolish, Mary thought he was ridiculous." Well, according to my mother, there were very few limitations as to what Tom could have been and what Mary might have thought of him. So I never did well on tests like that. The same was true with word analogies, pairs of words in which you are supposed to find some sort of logical semantic relationship. For example, sunset is to nightfall as blank is to blank. And here you would be presented with a list of 4 possible pairs, one of which showed the same kind of relationship. Red is to stoplight, bus is to arrival, chills is to fever, yawn is to boring. Well, I could never think that way. I knew what the tests were asking, but I couldn't block out of my mind the images already created by the first pair. Sunset is to nightfall, and I'd see a burst of colors against the darkening sky, the moon rising, the lowering of a curtain of stars. And all the other pairs of words, red, bus, stoplight, boring, just threw up a mass of confusing images, making it impossible for me to sort out something as logical as saying, a sunset precedes nightfall is the same as a chill precedes a fever. The only way I would have gotten that answer right would have been to imagine an associative situation. For example, my being disobedient and staying out past sunset, catching a chill at night which turns into feverish pneumonia as punishment, which indeed did happen to me. I've been thinking about all this lately, about my mother's English, about achievement tests, because lately I've been asked, as a writer, why are there not more Asian Americans represented in American literature? Why are there few Asian Americans enrolled in creative writing programs? Why do so many Chinese students go into engineering? Well, these are broad sociological questions I can't begin to answer, but I have noticed in surveys, in fact just last week, the Asian students as a whole always do significantly better on math achievement tests than in English, and this makes me think that there are other Asian American students whose English, spoken in the home, might also be described as, quote, broken or limited. And perhaps they also have teachers who are steering them away from writing and into math and science, which is what happened to me. Fortunately, I happen to be rebellious in nature and enjoy the challenge of disproving assumptions made about me. I became an English major my first year in college after being enrolled as pre-med. I started writing nonfiction as a freelancer the week after I was told by my former boss that writing was my worst skill, and I should hone my talents toward account management. But it wasn't until 1985 that I finally began to write fiction. And at first, I wrote using what I thought of my wittily crafted sentences. Sentences that would finally prove I had mastery over the English language. Here's an example from the first draft of a story that later made its way into the Joy Luck Club. But without this line, that was my mental quandary in its nascent state, which is a terrible line, which I can barely pronounce. Fortunately, for reasons I won't get into today, I later decided I should envision a reader for the stories I would write. And the reader I decided upon was my mother, because these were stories about mothers. So with this reader in mind, and in fact she did read my early drafts, I began to write stories using all the Englishes I grew up with. The English I spoke to my mother, which for lack of a better term might be described as simple. The English she used with me, which for lack of a better term might be described as broken. My translation of her Chinese, which could certainly be described as watered down, and what I imagined to be her translation of her Chinese, if she could speak in perfect English, her internal language, and for that I sought to preserve the essence, but not either in an English or a Chinese structure. I wanted to capture what language ability tests can never reveal, her intent, her passion, her imagery, the rhythms of her speech, and the nature of her thoughts. Apart from what any critic had to say about my writing, I knew I had succeeded where it counted when my mother finished reading my book and gave me her verdict. So easy to read.